This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and today we're getting the series underway in a very exciting way, talking about first-round pick Ben Danford. Before we dive into things, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and introduce you to what the series is going to be all about before we get into the meat and potatoes of Ben Danford's game. Over these next few weeks leading up to camp and ultimately the October 9th start of the brand new season, we're going to be profiling every single player in the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. That's players projected to be on the NHL roster, guys that are signed on NHL contracts but are probably going to be playing in the AHL, and even some of those notable prospects in the pipeline coming up in the next couple of seasons. And throughout the series, we're going to have on a bunch of different guests. It's going to be a really, really fun time going through every single player in the Leafs organization to get you set for the brand new season. So without further ado, let's dive into things about Ben Danford. And I can't think of a better way to kick things off than probably the newest guy in the organization that most people don't know much about. And of course, that's going to be a guy drafted in the first round this past year that people want to know about. And Ben Danford, taken 31st overall by the Maple Leafs, was somebody that wasn't really on my radar as a first round pick heading into the draft. And looking back on it, he probably should have been on my radar. He was a first round grade by Elite Prospects, ranked 30th overall by them in their final ranking, and he was ranked top 40 as well by Cam Robinson, who contributes to that Elite Prospects ranking, and also Rachel Doerrie with ESPN. Now, part of the reason why Danford wasn't really considered in that first round mix is because some of the other major public lists didn't really have him in that range at all. Bob McKenzie's list, who gets his list through scouts actively in the NHL and around the league, had him at 54th. Pretty solid second round prospect, but probably not somebody really you think of going in the first round. Jason Bukala, a former NHL scout that writes for Sportsnet, had him at 69th overall, and Craig Button had him among the lowest among public rankings at 78th. So you look at a player with that kind of ranking across the NHL and across the public sphere, and you don't really consider him as a first-round prospect or a likely first-round prospect going into the draft process. So when I'm preparing things for my day-to-day job for different prospect stuff going in the first round, he wasn't really somebody that I had considered. Looking at what the Leafs were probably going to target on draft day throughout basically the whole draft process, as soon as they kept their first-round pick past the trade deadline, we kind of figured that it would probably be a defenseman, just given the lack of defensemen in the prospect pool. They hadn't taken a defenseman in the first round since Rasmus Sandin a handful of years ago. There was a big need on defense in the prospect pool, and that first round pick that they kept could be a prime asset to address that organizational need. And I know you draft best player available, all that kind of stuff, but at a certain point you do need to replenish the cupboards, and with a lot of defensemen available in this draft, it's something that matched up well for the Maple Leafs needs and also what was available in this draft. And so going through that process, you look at the names available in their range, and there was a top 6 kind of consensus defense prospects that all ended up going in the top 12. I personally consider Adam Jiricek and ultimately Stian Solberg in that top 8 as well, that guy of guys who were all basically projected to go in a certain range, likely before the Maple Leafs picked. And that's where I'm going to stop there, because the Leafs did have one of those players on the clock at 23rd overall, and that was Stian Solberg. And ultimately, the Leafs decided to trade down, get some more ammo, and get one of their guys still in the first round. Now, at the time, it's good asset management just to get another pick, because a lot of those guys in the 20s, 30s are fairly interchangeable, and we'll get to that in a second. But for a player like Stian Solberg, I think a lot of people just kind of loved his makeup, like some comparisons to Radko Gudas. Very physical player, played in Norway of all places in their pro league, in what is a great class for Norway talent, with Michael Brandsegg Nygaard also going in the first round. And the big progression from the beginning of the season to the end of the season for Solberg, finishing the season in such a good way at the World Championships, playing big minutes, playing against top competition there, and succeeding and looking very good doing so. Athletic, rangy defender, very physical, all those attributes. And you kind of think, yeah, this is kind of a perfect prospect for the Maple Leafs. Maybe an accelerated timeline, somebody that could get to the NHL a little bit sooner, but maybe not quite the same upside as some of the other players are in that range, things like that, maybe. But ultimately, the Leafs decided to trade down, get an extra second round pick there, and take somebody else at the end of the first round. And looking at what the trade ended up being, I think you could definitely make a case to keep that slot and just take Solberg and take the better prospect as it currently is, the more well-rounded prospect as it currently is, the guy that's played against top competition, the guy that's played big minutes at World Championships, things like that. But at the same time, you're getting a comparable kind of floor-ceiling type player in Danford. You also get a second-round pick that they ended up turning into a seventh-round pick and a second-round pick next year, which becomes a very intriguing aspect when you consider how important draft capital is going to be for the Maple Leafs going forward. And if you don't have draft capital for 2025, you don't have the ability to make like any moves at the trade deadline. So that trade down, ultimately, given the subsequent trade that the Maple Leafs made with that pick that they got from the Ducks, gives them the flexibility to do something more at the trade deadline or to keep the pick and get another prospect. So would you like to get maybe a little bit more value trading out of a current second round pick to next year than just literally the last pick in the draft? Yeah, probably. But from an asset management point of view and from what gives the Maple Leafs the most options, I do think ultimately the trade down is probably going to be the best for the team long term, just because it gives them ammunition for this upcoming season, which, again, at the end of the day, you're trying to win games, you're trying to win the cup. And a second round pick next season gives you the flexibility to add to this year's roster more than just having one prospect in Stian Solberg would. So getting back to Danford, the prospect, and kind of why he wasn't on my radar for the first round is there were so many kind of similar mold defensemen that were projected to go in this range. You look at EJ Emery, rangy, physical defenseman, size, skating ability out of the national team development program. He was projected to go in this range. He ended up going 30th overall. So he wasn't even an option for Toronto after they traded down. Fair enough. You look at Charlie Elick, another rangy, physical defenseman who can skate and has size. He was somebody projected to go in that range. He ended up going in the 30s to the Blue Jackets. Dominic Bedinka, another right-handed, rangy defender with a little bit of size. He ends up going in the 30s to Carolina. And I think you could even throw a player like Harrison Brunick in this range as well, who ended up going in the 40s to Pittsburgh, but another right-hand shot defenseman who has a lot of similar traits. And so when you look at a group of like 3 to 4 right-handed shot defensemen who all have fairly similar positive traits and attributes and things like that, Danford kind of slips down the board there, I guess, because of a perceived difference in ceiling or likelihood or whatever it is. And that's fine. But when he goes in that range and kind of look and compare it to everybody, there's a lot of reason why Danford should have been considered in that range in the very first place. He has the same attributes, right-handed shot, mobile, strong defensive skill set, that kind of stuff. It's kind of blanket across the board for all these players. But you look at Danford's pedigree. He was a first-round pick in the OHL to the Oshawa Generals. Played at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup for Canada at the beginning of the season. Now, wasn't his best showing. And that's maybe part of the reason why he wasn't in that kind of top 30, top 40 range for most people, just because the early season wasn't as good. But he did play for Canada at that tournament and was one of the top players in the age group for Canada at that tournament. And then he played important minutes on a top OHL team that went all the way to the OHL finals and lost to a great team in the London Knights. And in that series, he had great moments showing his compete level in physicality and defensive effort in some big blowout games, blocking a ton of shots, getting in lanes that not a lot of people would want to do in a tight game, let alone a game that's like 8-0 and things like that. So you look at all of that and you look back at Danford and it's like, okay, he wasn't really projected to go in this range, but based off of all those factors, he probably should have been, and he's pretty comparable to all those guys in that range. And you tick all the boxes and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this totally makes sense as a Maple Leafs draft pick. The rangy mobility, the great defensive game currently that's very projectable to the NHL level, that gives him a really good floor to basically be somebody that you can feel pretty confident about being a depth or third pair guy at the very least. And if you can develop that offensive game, then all of a sudden you're talking about like a legit top 4 defenseman, right-handed shot that the Leafs have been looking for forever and is always a coveted asset. Just look at what they did to get Chris Tanev committing 6 years for a 34-year-old. If you can get that kind of player at the end of the first round, you are very, very happy. And so I got to see Danford for the first time live at development camp a few weeks ago. And obviously the first thing that stands out is his very, very good skating, and it's specifically the defensive skating. Skating backwards, keeping up with a lot of pacey players. Something that really stood out in my notes that I was making was there was a few drills that they were doing with the defensemen there in kind of some odd man rush situations. And every single time that a pass was made at the blue line and the player bobbled the puck for even a half second, Danford was right on them, breaking up the play, causing commotion, making things difficult on the players in those situations. And that is what you really like about Danford's game, is that neutral zone defense. And with that skating ability, the ability to keep gaps and to jump on players at the right time and break up rush chances. Because, of course, we know rush chances are the most dangerous chances in the NHL. And if you can't even break into the zone, you're not going to be able to create anything offensively. So that was the thing that I noticed first and foremost, and the best stuff that I saw from him at development camp and certain drills and ultimately the scrimmage and things like that. There were a couple times where on retrievals and kind of board play, I don't know if it was a lack of urgency, too much belief in kind of his skating ability to get out of certain situations, or maybe an overconfidence in his puck skills, or maybe a combination of all of those, where he got himself into a bit of trouble and kind of lost the puck, turned things over a couple times. Clean that up, and we'll get to that in my conversation here in a second. And that's kind of like the big area I look at, and kind of the little bit that I saw live there that could be cleaned up for sure. And talking with the guest that we're going to get to in a second here, that seems to be a theme a little bit over the course of the season. There was one play in the scrimmage that really stood out, and it was the first goal that Danford was a key part of. And talking after the scrimmage with Assistant General Manager Haley Wickenheiser, the program lead for player development for the Maple Leafs, she mentioned this play as well, where Danford, again, just kind of activates down the right side, takes an easy pass, bobbles it a little bit if memory serves, but takes that pass, not even needing to beat players with a skating or anything like that, a pretty routine play, takes it down the right side, and instead of cycling all the way behind the net, he scoops a pass right in front to Miroslav Holinka, who was popping out in the slot, and just like that, it was 1-0 Team Blue. Little plays like that is what's going to be big for Ben Danford's development here in these next few years. And we know the defensive game. I've talked about it already. We're going to talk about it a bunch with my guests coming up. The defensive game is the name of the game for Danford. It's what he can be offensively that can really unlock that kind of top four potential. And being confident in activation, being confident in his skating ability to beat players in the offensive zone and to create things offensively, you don't need to have the best puck skills to be able to make those simple plays activating. The whole part of activating in the play is to create odd man situations, get the offensive zone moving, and create space. And Danford, with his intelligence, with his skating, and with certain structures, can absolutely take advantage of that. And we saw that a little bit in the beginning of that scrimmage with that first goal. And it's something that Haley Wickenheiser talked about as well in that scrimmage, and kind of seeing that offensive potential that the Maple Leafs see in Ben Danford to take him as high as they did ultimately relative to where a lot of people thought he would end up going. And before we get to the upcoming interview with my guest, I think it's important to note, after that interview that I did was recorded, the Maple Leafs signed Ben Danford to a 3-year entry-level contract. And for prospects like him, it's essentially a 5-year entry-level contract, because the contract will slide twice because of his age. He's junior eligible for this season and the season after, before he can finally play pro games as a 2006 born player. So unless Danford plays more than 9 games in an NHL season the next 2 years, that contract will slide twice and will carry him all the way until the end of the 28-29 season. And it's very rare for 19-year-old defensemen to play in the NHL, especially those not taken very, very high in the draft. So no, don't consider it as a very realistic possibility at all for Danford to not slide that second year. He'll almost certainly be back with Oshawa for that second season of the entry-level contract and slide again. So that entry-level contract will take him through 28-29. And to give you an idea of how much runway that gives the Maple Leafs by signing him in this first season to get that first-year slide and things like that, Nick Robertson just finished his entry-level contract. It feels like he's been around for forever, and part of that is due to COVID and how weird the whole situation was. But Nick Robertson just finished his last year of his entry-level contract. He signed that when he was drafted. That contract slid twice because he was playing primarily in junior, and that's how things work. Of course, that second year, he was actually playing in the AHL again. Very weird circumstances, but all you need to know is that that contract slid twice. And so only just now, at 22 years old, did Nick Robertson finish out his entry-level contract. And he played basically a full season in the NHL on that deal. played a bunch of NHL games kind of sporadically. And that's what you're looking at for a player like Ben Danford. Can he make an impact on your NHL roster in kind of his age 20 to 22 seasons? Kind of probably by the end of that, as a first round pick, you're hoping that he can break into the roster and do something at the bottom of your lineup and be a cheap piece on an entry level contract that can make an impact. So we'll see how things play out in that regard. So I'm very excited to finally get to the interview today, and it's a very, very good one. I had a great conversation with the McKeen's director of scouting, Brock Otten, on Ben Danford, his progression over the season, what he saw from him in the pre-draft process, and kind of what we can expect from him this upcoming season and into the future. So let's get to that now, my conversation with Brock Otten on Ben Danford. Pleased to be joined now by Director of Scouting for McKeen's, Brock Otten. Brock, thanks for taking the time in the summer here to talk a little bit about Maple Leafs first rounder Ben Danford.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kyle.
Yeah, so I think we should just get right into things. Before the draft, you wrote a great profile about Danford and kind of detailing his strengths and weaknesses at this time. And so what were some of your key takeaways in diving into the tape in Danford in the pre-draft process?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things was just seeing some of the improvement in his play with the puck. I think one of the things that I had written about is I felt a lot of people sort of wrote off Danford in terms of his upside based on his play earlier in the year. He struggled a little bit at the Hlinka with the puck, and I felt like early on with Oshawa struggling early on in the OHL season, those struggles kind of continued. And then as Oshawa started to get rolling when Callum Ritchie came back and the team was playing much better, his game really found another level. And I think kind of going back and comparing the tape, between early season to end of the year, his game had improved so much. And I think that's one of the things that really drew the attention of the Maple Leafs. And I think it's one thing that you really should be focusing on when you're looking at drafting players high, in the NHL draft. You're looking for players who aren't going to plateau, that are, following not a linear sort of development pathway. They're continuing to get better, and they're seeing, a rapid rise in their improvement.
Yeah, and that rapid rise you talk about fits exactly what the Maple Leafs looked for the previous year in the draft in Easton Cowan, who finished the year very strong in the playoffs. And so in that pre-draft process in scouting and doing a great article on Danford, you kind of noted online that you thought that this would be a guy that would surprise people in where he went in the draft. You guys mocked him at 32nd at McKeen's. He ended up going 31st to the Maple Leafs. And so why did you feel this way about Danford, that he would be a guy that public consensus was kind of mid-second round prospect? But why did you feel this way, that he would be a guy that would surprise and ultimately get inside the first round?
Well, I think there's sort of like a bunch of different reasons here, and I'll try to touch on sort of all of them, I guess. So the first would be he's not the, for lack of a better term, sexiest prospect, right? We're not talking about a flashy defender. We're not talking about a guy that drew a ton of attention on, we'll call it the public scouting forum, if you will, the Twitter scouting forum. He wasn't somebody that was drawing a lot of attention there, and there wasn't a lot being written about him over the course of the year. So, that's sort of number one. Number two, he was somebody that, as I said, improved so much over the course of the year, and we're seeing NHL teams really focus in on those kinds of players. We saw Becca Seneca go third overall to Anaheim for that very same reason, right? This was a guy that up to about the midpoint of that draft year, where we were seeing sort of in that like 15 to 22 range on a lot of lists, on a lot of mocks that were early. And he improved so much over the course of the year, and suddenly, it was, okay, now he's a lottery pick, and now he's a top 10 pick. Well, now he's getting consideration for the top 5, right? And those, like I said, those are the players that NHL teams are really focusing in on. They want to see players finishing out the year well. They don't want to see a plateau. They want to see players continue to get better, so that it shows evidence of work ethic. It shows evidence of learning and being able to soak in and improve. And Danford is the perfect example of that. At the very baseline, you've got a guy that is going to play in the NHL, in my opinion. He's going to be, at the very least, somebody who can play on a penalty kill, somebody who can, take a regular shift on a third pairing and not hurt you, depending on how his confidence improves with the puck, his play improves with the puck, you could be looking at much more than that. And I think that's another reason why he was somebody that the Leafs and probably other organizations were really looking at is, okay, this is a guy that has a very solid floor, but a ceiling that is still sort of being assessed, right? There's still more to his game. And it worked for Easton Cowan. It's worked for many other organizations with many other picks in recent years, focusing on those sort of late risers, those late season improvers. You don't want those guys that are the same player in September as they are in April or May.
Yeah, and on draft day, there was a consensus top kind of 8 defensemen on draft day, the obvious top 6 that ended up going in the top 12. I think you can also throw Adam Yurchek and Steen Solberg into that kind of top 8 that we kind of expected to go in some order in the top 8, and then among defensemen. And then there was a group of kind of similar style right-handed defensemen after that who big, rangy, good skaters, size, that kind of stuff, right-hand shots, the EJ Emerys, Charlie Elix, Dominic Badinka. You can even maybe throw Harrison Brunick in there if you wanted to. That was kind of the next tier of perceived player. And Danford kind of ticks a lot of those similar boxes. So do you think it comes down to the fact that people maybe saw Danford early in the year and didn't come back to him later in the year? And that's why we didn't really see him, at least in that perceived tier of that next caliber defenseman after those top 8?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think also he's a player that didn't play at the U18s because of his long run in the OHL playoffs with Oshawa, right? And that also pushes sort of public perception, right? You've got EJ Emery that played at that event. You've got Harrison Brunick that played at that event. Dominik Badinka didn't play at that event, but he was also a late birthday. And he was another guy that I felt didn't really get as much attention as he probably should have. Ended up being drafted a lot higher than a lot of public lists had him. And those types of defenders, you named off a lot of them. We'll throw Adam Kleber in that mix as well. That sort of new age, mobile, shutdown defender. Those are the types of guys that we're seeing teams win in the playoffs with these days, and that's why they're being targeted. And that's why the Leafs took Ben Danford. That's why Anaheim took Steen Solberg. That's why the Rangers took EJ Emery. Right? Those are the kinds of guys that you win in the playoffs with these days, and they're going to continue to be valued at the draft. We're going to see that this year. We're going to see it, next year. It's just going to continue to happen, and organizations are really targeting that sort of athletic build and profile that's kind of different from 15, 20 years ago when it was just big physical brutes, for lack of a better term, right, that were being targeted in that range as potential shutdown guys. Well, the game has changed. The pace is so much quicker. You've got to be able to skate, and you're looking for guys who have a high compete level but also great mobility, and that's what Danford is. That's what Emery is. That's what Charlie Elick is, and that's why those guys went where they did.
Yeah, you mentioned the mobility, and the defensive skating is really one of the things that first stands out when you watch Danford play. It's one of the things that I noticed first when I saw him at development camp as well. It's something that is a really attractive trait. Would you consider that to, at least at this time, be like his top quality as a prospect right now?
Yeah, I would say other than just compete level, I would say the mobility is definitely one of his biggest assets. Forward mobility, he's just such a fluid skater in all 4 directions. And I think he's somebody that is still learning to unlock his skating ability in terms of being an offensive player. I think we sort of saw that in the OHL playoffs, and we saw it late in the year. I think he needs to watch a guy like Sam Dickinson in London with how he uses his quickness to be a dangerous player off the puck, jumping up on the play, beating forecheckers down the ice, picking those spots. And I think that's something Danford can do, and it's something that we did see later in the year. You don't have to be a magician, you don't have to be Cale Makar, you don't have to be Quinn Hughes to put up points from the back end in the NHL, right? You can provide offensive contributions in other ways, and I think that's something that Danford's going to build confidence in doing. I think he's going to learn that, his skating ability does give him a nice advantage. He doesn't have to be, extremely creative or extremely skilled with the puck. He just has to, find those situations to be able to leverage his speed and his quickness away from the puck, to jump up in the play, to be, that third or fourth man in, to lead the rush when the opportunity provides or presents itself to him, and just gaining that confidence.
Yeah, and with the great mobility and four-way mobility that you talk about, that naturally leads to really impressive neutral zone and rush defense. How does that kind of neutral zone defense compare to his in zone defense as well?
Yeah, he's very aggressive, and I think that's what you want to see these days, right? You want to deny entry, right? You want to be difficult to play against. You want to clog the neutral zone. You don't want to just give teams free entry into your offensive zone. Obviously, you do have to pick your spots. You have to um, you there are some situations where you have to be a little bit more conservative, but you do want to see a player who knows when to be aggressive, and I think that's Ben, and I think that he has a good understanding. While I said that he doesn't have a great understanding yet of how to use his skating ability offensively, I think he has a very clear understanding of how to use his mobility defensively. And he knows that he can be a little bit more aggressive than other players because, if he ends up picking the wrong time to be aggressive, jumping up in the neutral zone to try to, blow a play up, he has that recovery ability because his mobility. As long as he trusts his teammates and as long as their structure is sound, he's going to be okay and he's going to be able to play that way. He's one of the more difficult players already in the OHL to beat 101 to the outside. And again, that's because of that mobility. He doesn't have the reach of, a 6'4", 6'5" defender. So his gap control and his understanding of how to use his mobility to keep players in front of him is really, really important.
Yeah, and so with the skating ability and things like that, one of the other key traits that you mentioned early on there was that competitiveness and the intensity that Danford plays with. And one of the great things that you kind of outlined in the pre-draft process is, look, he played on a great team in Oshawa. They went on a deep run, but some of those games in the OHL final were tough, just given some of the injuries and everything that Oshawa was dealing with. And yet, in some of those blowout games, late in those games, Danford was still laying out for some big, tough block shots and things like that. The constant intensity almost that he plays with is really, really impressive. Can you talk a little bit about how that stood out to you and kind of really impressed you through the pre-draft process?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I look at. When you're covering the CHL, you're going to have situations where there's going to be blowouts. There are some teams that are really
That's
bad. There are
junior
some teams that
hockey.
are
Yeah.
exactly, and there are some teams that are really, really good, and you're not going to be on your best every night. It's just not going to happen. You're still developing as a hockey player. But the one thing that I really look at is that compete level. Your team's losing 5-6-1. Are you just giving up on the back check? Are you still blocking shots? Are you still trying to put in an effort? Are you a team player? I think it speaks volumes to your character as a player. And I think that was one thing that had always sort of drawn me towards Danford, even when he was struggling a little bit with the puck in the first half of the year, was this was a guy that just never quit on a play. Shift to shift, he was so consistent with that compete level. He was always battling, always trying to make it difficult for the opposition to gain space when he's on the ice. And I think as other parts of his game sort of came around, that never dropped. And I think sometimes you see that, right? When players are trying to improve in other areas, you might see a dip in areas that maybe were a bit of a strength previously because it's kind of a trade-off, right? But for Danford, when the offensive game started to improve later in the year, the defensive game never dipped and the compete level never dipped. And I think that's why Toronto took him where they did. And I think that's why another team would have taken him higher if Toronto didn't. I think he's somebody that, like I said, has that really solid floor because the compete level and the mobility, are going to play. It's just a matter of how high.
Yeah, the shot blocking that we talk about there is a key component for any kind of defensive defenseman and penalty killer and things like that. What is it that makes a good shot blocker? Is it as simple as just the compete level and being willing to throw your body in lanes where some people aren't, or is there more technical and mechanical elements to it that maybe go overlooked?
Yeah, I think that's obviously a main component of it, right? I don't know about you, but I might be a
Yeah.
little bit hesitant to take a 98 mile per hour slap shot to the shin. But I think it takes a special kind of person. It takes that competitive kind of person to just consistently lay the body out for their team. But there is definitely an art to it. there's a timing component to it. And I think that's something Danford and some other players that are sort of defensive specialists need to learn before they get to that pro level, right? Because players at the AHL level, even let alone the NHL level, are too good in baiting you into, getting down early into sort of your shot blocking position, right? And then they'll abuse that, and suddenly, your team is at a disadvantage as you're left scrambling out of position. So I think that there definitely is a timing component to it, and understanding, when you should be aggressive with your stick, and when you can get into those spots and block those shots. Also, communication with your netminder is imperative too, and understanding, not being a complete screen for your netminder is important too. So there's a lot of things that go into it. I think it's definitely a bit of an art form. It does take compete, but there's a reason why some guys are way better at it at the NHL level than others. It's more than that.
We've talked a lot about Danford's defensive game, and the offensive game is kind of the area that is kind of the big question of whether he can be a third pair depth defenseman at the NHL level, or if he can kind of hit some of those higher heights. And in the post draft process, the Maple Leafs have said that they think that there's a lot of untapped potential there. Brad Treliving said that they think that Danford's just scratching the surface of his game at development camp. Wickenheiser a few times reiterated the fact that the Leafs believe that there's some untapped offensive potential there to be shown in what he showed last year in the OHL. How do you view Danford's offensive game at this stage?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we're going to ever look at, a 60, 70 point, offensive defender at the NHL level. That's not going to happen. But this is somebody, like I said, who's still learning to sort of weaponize his speed, because he is extremely quick. And I think when he understands, that can give him a greater advantage. And I think when he learns to be more confident in really jumping up in the play and being more aggressive offensively, I think that's when we're going to start to see the offensive production, increase. I think his play in the offensive zone is pretty sound. I think he's pretty smart with the puck. I think he does have potential, maybe not necessarily as a traditional power play quarterback, but he's smart enough to get pucks on net, to be able to possibly evade sort of that first layer of pressure as his hands get better. Because again, the mobility is good. The hands don't even have to be world class because his mobility is solid. It's just about continuing to build on the skill, the confidence, and the ability to use his speed, taking better routes to retrievals. So, he can get the puck up ice quicker, making quicker decisions with the puck in the defensive end to start the breakout, getting those secondary assists to help his team, being more aggressive off the puck, working on his shot, from the point to be a little bit more of an offensive weapon in the offensive zone. Those are all things that he's going to work on over the next 2 years in the OHL. And I think he's sort of in a great situation in Oshawa too, where there's not going to be a ton of pressure on him per se to be an offensive juggernaut. Oshawa is going to have a really good team again next year, and they return their top power play quarterback in Luca Morelli. So Danford's not going to have to suddenly quarterback a power play one at the junior level on a really good team and have a ton of pressure. He's going to continue to develop defensively and offensively. And then, the following year, if everything goes according to plan, that's when he can sort of take over power play duties at the OHL level, which is a big step. I mean, if you're not, very rarely anyway, there's a few instances, but if you're not putting up points at the OHL level, it's very rare to see players do that at the NHL level. So that'll be a big step.
Yeah, and the skating and kind of the activation play is another key component in that kind of offensive potential where, yeah, like you said, you don't necessarily need the hands or the puck skills to be an effective player when you have that skating and the ability to activate in the modern NHL and almost positionless offensive styles. And the Leafs have been kind of at the forefront in past years of really getting defensemen active in the zone. And with that kind of comes a certain confidence they have to play with in terms of your belief in the offensive zone and your abilities in the system and things like that. How did you see Danford's offensive confidence kind of progress over the season?
Yeah, it progressed a lot. Like I said, as Oshawa started to improve when Cal Ritchie came back, um, Danford was sort of at the forefront of that. His play really picked up, along with a guy like Beckett Seneca we talked about earlier. The team sort of found its mojo, and you could just see his confidence blossoming. He's making quicker decisions with the puck. He was taking chances away from the puck and with the puck, and just becoming a more of a dual threat than he was sort of previously. And I think it's just about continuing to foster that and continuing to grow. And we'll see sort of where that upside ends up landing eventually. But it's gonna require some patience. Danford definitely has the defensive acumen, and Toronto's just going to be very patient with him as he improves offensively, just to see sort of where that upside, as I said, ends up falling. But ultimately, he was, in my opinion, the perfect kind of selection. I think most Leafs fans were anticipating that they would go this sort of route with that pick, right? When Solberg was there and before they had traded down, right? I think a lot of us, especially on the draft floor in Vegas, were anticipating, okay, here goes Solberg. He fell a little bit. But ultimately they traded down and felt that Ben probably gave them something similar, but they could pick up a little bit of extra draft capital there. So that type of player was the perfect target for Toronto, because I think even the most amateur Leafs fan will tell you from watching just a couple of games of Toronto Maple Leafs hockey in the last couple of years, that type of defender, that new age shutdown defender, is exactly what this team has sort of been missing. It's kind of, they tried to address that at the deadline this past year. But ultimately, those were veteran guys who, had a lot of miles, and maybe the mobility just wasn't there anymore. And I think you have to find a homegrown talent, I think, and that's what the target was, and Danford fits that mold.
Yeah, and even this upcoming season, I think we could get a glimpse, if everything goes right for Danford, in terms of the type of player he could end up becoming, and a Chris Tanev type there that the Leafs have brought in this year, who for a long time has been one of the most underrated defensive defensemen, in terms of that, willing to do whatever it takes on the ice, and putting up strong underlying numbers. And I think if you get something like that out of the draft, you've hit a home run in terms of a Chris Tanev type. But you did mention the trade down there, and I did want to get to that. Stian Solberg, sorry, was on the board at, I believe it was 23 that they traded down from. Ended up getting an extra second round pick that they then flipped for a 2025 pick. So getting
Yeah.
some ammo to either use at next year's draft or to use at the trade deadline, depending on how things go this season. What did you make of that move? Would you have taken Solberg at 23, or do you think the value the Leafs got moving down, getting Danford later in the draft and picking up a future second round pick was worth the kind of wait on draft day?
Yeah, I won't lie. Solberg was a guy that we ranked higher at McKeen's. I think there's just maybe a little bit more perceived upside there with him, but I don't think it's drastic. So I can see why the allure was there to trade down and get a similar player. And realistically, I'm going to guess that the Leafs probably had a few targets in that range, right? They probably liked Ben Danford. I'm pretty sure they liked EJ Emery as well, a similar kind of player. So they felt, you know what? Yeah, we probably like Solberg, but if we trade down and pick up that extra second round pick, we're going to get a similar kind of player with a similar kind of upside, and we're going to help our organization by picking up another asset. The trade of that second round pick for one the following year, I was a little bit more sketchy on. Normally, you see a little bit more value given. It kind of was like a fairly lateral trade.
Yeah.
Because I would imagine that the pick that they acquired falls in a very similar range to the one that they traded. So it's kind of like just a straight swap of different years. Typically, you see, more value given to the more recent year. So I would have liked to have seen maybe, a second and like a late third or a fourth, because you saw some other deals of the draft that were that exact same thing. And I think that was sort of the chatter in Vegas as well. Like people were like, hang on, just a straight second, like just a straight second swap. We're used to seeing more than that. But I digress. I think when you look at the fact that there were so many similar kinds of players to Solberg available in that range at the end of the first, it makes sense because yes, right now I would say Solberg is a better player, but in the grand scheme of things, it's all about projection. And if the projection from your scouting staff is pretty much linear for all of these players, it makes sense to acquire more assets.
Yeah, looking at how the season progressed for Danford, one of the things that you mentioned as a key improvement over the course of the season was some of the, not necessarily processing speed, but some of the urgency that he made some of his plays with early in the season, getting caught up, maybe believing too much in his skating ability to get out of certain situations and making some of those plays a little bit faster, really helping push play back up the ice. Is that one of the key areas that you saw as a big improvement over the course of the season?
Yeah, I think so for sure, and I think it's still an area that's going to need further improvement. I think I mentioned earlier about just taking better routes to retrievals. I
Mm-hmm.
think when you're looking at a guy that skates as well as he does, you as you gain more experience, you're going to learn that you can approach those retrievals at different angles and really learn to, again, I'm going to use that same term, but weaponize your speed to exit the zone quicker, right? And not put yourself in those positions where now you're crumbling under the forecheck when you could have escaped easily with your feet, right? And I think that's a big thing for Danford, using those shoulder checks more effectively, taking those better routes and just making quicker decisions to start the breakout. I think that's the big next step for him. I think it did improve for sure over the course of the OHL season, especially into the playoffs. But it needs to improve further. And he's not alone. I think a lot of defenders that get drafted, other than a guy like a Zane Parekh or some of the guys that are puck movers by nature, most of those guys need to improve that very thing before they hit that next level, that processing speed with the puck in their own zone. Just because, forecheckers at the next level are just so much quicker. They get on you so much faster, and your speed in terms of your ability to anticipate and see the ice just needs to be that much quicker.
One of the cool insights we get out of the OHL is the coaches poll at the end of the season, and Danford got a lot of love from coaches around the OHL in that poll. Was actually voted the top defensive defenseman in his conference, the second best shot blocker, third hardest worker. How much does that say about Danford in terms of the respect that he has across the OHL to get that much love from coaches around the league as a draft eligible player?
Yeah, I think it speaks volumes. It's very rare to see a draft eligible defender, do as well as he did, especially in the defensive categories. You will see it in the offensive categories, especially at forward.
I saw it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, but defensively, it's typically the older players that dominate, those defensive categories. And I think, again, it speaks volumes. On one hand, you also have to mention the fact that maybe something that people don't realize about the OHL coaches poll is that you can only nominate one player per team for each category. So I'm not saying you have to take it with a grain of salt, but I think
It's
it's
worth
something
noting,
that
certainly.
it's worth noting. Exactly, because there are some guys who might be better, but because their team can only put forth, one person per category, it's going to, in essence, water down the list a little bit and limit some of the choices that coaches have. But that's not to take anything away from Danford. He deserved the mention that he got in the coaches poll.
Yeah, and so as we start to wrap up here, I think looking at the course of the season, in some of the things that you noted earlier, and kind of some of the maybe issues that Danford had early in the season to the strong finish to the year, kind of playing a role in maybe the perception around the player being a little bit lesser than what it really was at the end of the season going into the draft. If you were to note the biggest area that you saw Danford improve from the Hlinka Gretzky to the end of the season, what would that area be?
I think it would be the ability to play off the puck offensively. I think that was where we started to see some of his improved production come from. Sliding back door, beating beating back checkers back down the ice, jumping up as a trailer, third or fourth man in, really looking to be a lot more aggressive as an offensive player. Realizing, okay, I've made that exit pass. Now we've got two guys trapped in our own end. I'm going to beat them down the ice, and we're going to turn this into, a 3-on-2, a 4-on-2, and those types of odd man opportunities was part of Oshawa's strength, I will say, in the second half and leading into the OHL playoffs, being able to play with pace. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, a guy like Sam Dickinson in London does that so well. And I think that there are other guys across the league in the pro level that do that as well. And I think that that's something that Danford's going to have to continue to do to put up points. And I think he will. I think that he's going to continue to grow. And I really, really love the selection by Toronto.
What do you have as your expectations for Danford coming into this upcoming season? You mentioned that you expect Oshawa to remain a very good team. You would expect potentially a full season of Cal Ritchie, depending on how things go there. Not getting returning players like Connor Punnett and things like that on defense are going to also provide more opportunity throughout the entire season. Of course, Punnett being a deadline acquisition, but things like that, and Danford finishing the season strong as well. What do you have as your expectations for Danford and what we could potentially see from him in his post-draft season?
Yeah, I think it's just about sort of maybe maintaining the pace that he was playing at in the playoffs and towards the end of the year. I think if at the end of the year we look and Danford is sort of in that like high 30s, low 40s range for his point production, I think that would be great. I think that would be a fantastic step in the right direction. And I think that, as I said, I think you can sort of expect the larger jump in production that following year when he sort of takes over the first power play unit. But Oshawa should be one of the best teams in the East again. I would say probably the preseason favorite. There might be a few other teams. Barry's had a really good offseason. They've got a veteran team that they're going to be returning. But I would say they're probably the favorite to come out of the East again preseason. Obviously, like you said, it depends on what happens with Cal Ritchie. But I would anticipate with the injuries that he had this past year that Colorado, is a little bit more patient with his development and sends him back. If all goes according to plan, I would anticipate another deep playoff run for Oshawa, and Danford's going to be right in the forefront of that. So I think, team success and individual success, that sort of like 35, 40 point plateau would be great.
And finally here, at this stage of his development, just after being drafted, going into that post-draft season that is so important in terms of kind of seeing how players really start to find their game after going through that draft cycle, getting that first development camp under their belt, working with NHL teams for the first time. What do you see as the most important factor in Danford at this stage, going from that kind of third pair projection to that kind of top 4 minute muncher at the NHL level?
Yeah, I think it's just improving his skill with the puck. I think that's sort of the big thing. I think that's sort of what separates somebody from being, a top pairing guy from being a bottom pairing guy, right? And at the NHL level, if you're playing as a regular player, you can make a breakup pass. Everybody can do that. If you can't make an exit pass, right, you're going to be that quad A guy who never escapes the AHL level, right? So I think setting the bar there in terms of just improving, his decision making with the puck and the defensive end, I think that's too low. I think, if we're going to alter the perception of his upside, like we kind of did with Easton Cowan, right? It relies on, improving his skill with the puck, improving his shot, improving some of those offensive intangibles. And I think that that's going to be the key for him, just as it was for Easton. I think when he was drafted, that was something that we had talked about as a scouting staff at McKeen's, that I think a lot of people had talked about was, this is a player who currently projects as a really solid complementary piece, but the skill with the puck needs to improve in order to drive play. And that's what happened. And there's no reason to think that the same thing can't happen with Ben if he takes his development seriously.
Well, Brock, thanks for taking the time here today. Awesome work at McKeen's that everyone should check out. Is there anything else you'd like to plug and tell the people where they can find your work?
Yeah, they can find me on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at Brock Otten. You can find my work at mckeenshockey.com. We're going to have some Hlinka stuff coming out in the next few days. I'm excited for the first event of the draft season.
Yeah, the prospect world never sleeps. As soon as the draft is done, you get like 2 weeks and then you're right back into it. Brock, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks again to Brock for coming on the show. It was an absolute joy to talk with him about Ben Danford and dive into everything about Danford's game, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did having it. That's going to do it for this one. Thanks for tuning in to this first episode of Camp Countdown. We're going to have a lot of these over the coming weeks leading up until the next Toronto Maple Leaf season. If you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe on wherever you find your podcast, whether that be Spotify, Apple, whether you want to watch the show on YouTube as well. And be sure to follow along on Twitter at Kyle_Cush, where you can find all of my updates and more and plenty of stuff regarding my content. So thanks for watching and have a good one. We'll see you next time on Maple Leafs Camp Countdown.